Thanks very much for that kind introduction. And pleasure to be here. Thanks to the Royal Canadian Institute for inviting me to speak. This is great. And I even see some familiar faces from the past here, so this is good. And it's also, sorry, let's put that down. Yeah, so this issue of rice agriculture, I mean, it sounds kind of esoteric, but I'm hoping to draw you in to why it even is relevant to us perhaps today to think about this and what this has to do with our past, our future, even the present, while sharing some insight into what I've been doing and this trip through China that I've been taking for the last, 30 years. I went to Japan to China in 1986 from Japan. Don't tell anybody this, but I was on a fellowship to Japan, and I was actually not supposed to leave the country while I was in Japan. But this invitation to pop over to China came up, and I wanted to go so that I could get something started there. So I was able to get a visa, hopped on a plane, went to Japan, came back a week or so later, and nobody knew the difference. So this is me in China in 1986. And I'm really showing this to you because in 1986, China was at the end of the Cultural Revolution. It was the beginning of sort of the modernization of China. And when I went there, I rarely saw a car. If you saw a car, it was driven by government officials. And everybody was on bicycles. Everybody generally dressed the same. And this is downtown Shanghai. Downtown Shanghai. Maybe some of you have been there recently. It doesn't look like that today. There was one skyscraper, one tall building in Shanghai in 1986, and that could be the one in the background. I'm not sure. But you're probably aware of what it looks like today. And one of the reasons I show you this is because in my lifetime, I've never seen a country modernized so rapidly. Absolutely outstanding. And so culture change in my lifetime, technological change has been rapid, and we kind of get familiar with how quickly things change. But back to the topic at hand, and things did change in the past for humans, but at a much slower pace. And I'd like to take a look at, first of all, how this pace worked. If we take 200,000 years ago as the beginning of modern humans, then we can get a sense of how much of our time has been involved with agriculture. And we could debate whether it's 200,000 years or 150,000 years. Something really extraordinary happened with human origins around 80,000 years ago. And much of our modernity comes from that event 80,000 years ago when the human species nearly disappeared from the face of the earth. Some anthropologists estimate there were only 5,000 of us left. But we survived and we modernized and moved forward. So a bit complicated, but we'll look at agriculture in a second. But if we look at our existence, only about 5% of the time our species has been around or has been involved in something we call agriculture. The rest of the time, we weren't agricultural. That's part of the reason why the popular press, the popular diet literature says the paleo diet is what we should be turning to, because we haven't really evolved yet to deal properly biologically with agricultural products like wheat and barley and so on. I mean, I beg to differ to some extent. It's more complicated than that, but you can see why it might be important to look at that period. But the reason agriculture becomes so interesting and so difficult at the same time is because it involves the interaction of genetics, behavior, and I say behavior because it's behavior of everything, behavior of plants, behavior of animals, and our own behavior that's involved, and then ecology. Inevitably, we have to think about something different going on in the ecology. So if we look at genetics, one of the things that really fascinates us is the evolution of what we call domesticated plants. Plants that have really latched on to us and we've latched on to them. And I just show you an extreme example here of corn. And we have corn, but its ancestor, the plant from a distance looks a little bit like corn, but this is the fruit of corn, and that's only about 5 centimeters long. So this is what corn looked like and looks like in the wild. But this is corn today. We all know what that is like. But the other thing about corn is that once it started spreading from its source of origin in Mexico, went to South America, came to the southwestern U.S., and ultimately into Ontario, so many different varieties developed. Every town probably had its own land race. Every region has its own type of corn. So it really diversified once it spread. So crops have a huge diversity, or potential for huge diversity, on this planet, but we're reducing it now, and I'm reducing that diversity. I'll say something about that in a minute. But what about animals? Animals are kind of amazing in this regard too, and I always love to give the example of dogs. So if we consider that dogs are actually wolves that have been tamed and brought into our lives, we get a sense of how things develop with them too. So these critters are exactly the same species and genetically very, very close to the wolf. I mean, it's just incredible to see this. And this diversification has happened only in recent history, probably, I suspect, in the last 150 years. There's a whole other world of dogs out there, and these are what we think of as village dogs or urban dogs or feral dogs. And according to a specialist on dogs at the University of Michigan, about 75% of the dogs in the world are without owners, without any, they just take care of themselves. And they do just fine. And this is one of them in India, photograph I took a couple of years ago. This colleague from Michigan actually says that these are actually the ancestors of all dogs, that these are actually wild dogs and that our dogs evolved from them. But diversity of dogs and the range of their behavior and where they live is just extraordinary. And the wolves had diversity, but they're becoming fewer and fewer in number. And you may have heard the news today that there is an assessment saying about that the wildlife on this planet since the 1970s has been reduced by about 60%. The species and so forth. So it's a little scary. So domestication is really intriguing. But then there's the setting in which these organisms live. And so we create these ecosystems. So we got to understand ecology, and I'm showing 4 different types of production, but there are many more than this. We have orchards with tree crops. We have shade-grown coffee here, where we're trying to get back to ecologically sensitive ways of growing crops. But we're used to kind of this image of agriculture being a monocrop system where we use pesticides and fertilizers and everything's neatly lined up in rows. I think a lot of people sort of envision that as agriculture. But in parts of the world where people are self-sustaining, we have market gardens where in this area you have a diversity of crops. I took this in a community near an archaeological site in China, and people are growing an amazing array of plants. Can spend all day walking around there trying to figure out what they're growing. So we get this huge array of what we might call agriculture. So there's the genetics, there's behavior, there's ecology, and then there's the setting and when it all developed. So just bear with me really quickly here. So one of the things about agriculture is it developed in different parts of the world, completely independently. So there wasn't one woman or one man who sort of thought about agriculture and then set into play a 5-year plan, and then 5 years later they had a committee and they assessed it and agriculture kicked off. No, not how it happened. Not how it happened. So next time you get called to a strategy meeting with your company or your board or something, humans didn't always do that. But agriculture, for some reason, developed independently in different parts of the world. Mexico, South America, Eastern North America. Sunflower comes from out here. Southwest Asia is the big one, with barley, wheat, all the different crops. South Asia is another one. Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa. We can go to South China, which will be the topic today. North China had its own development of agriculture, and then even Japan out here had some developments related to agriculture. And Japan's another really, really cool topic. Maybe another time we can talk about that. But the other interesting thing is when this all happened. It generally is all happening after 11,000 years ago. What's magic about 11,000 years ago? Now, if you go to the internet, you'll probably find out 11,000 years ago is when some mysterious ancestral society akin to Atlantis spread their knowledge around the world when it was met its demise, right? Okay. Back to reality. This is the end of the Pleistocene. The end of the Pleistocene, the last ice age ended, and then the Holocene began, and climate began to warm, and the vegetation that we're familiar with began to develop. The vegetation zones began to develop. But not everything happened 11,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago. We had some agriculture develop much later. But it is kind of curious, and we wonder, what's going on here? Was there some huge evolutionary jump in humanity, in our brain structure or something? But no, that doesn't appear to be the case. But we can look at a case study. China. So let's take a look at China. I'm gonna leave behind the north, which is really dry. This is where wheat and millets and soybean and so forth grow today. I want to take us into this central area where rice is growing. It's subtropical to tropical the further south you go, and it's really quite wet. Out here it gets hit by the monsoons, and the monsoons dry up. Up here you don't get much effect of the monsoons, so heavy summer rainfalls, flooding, rich resources, and this is the area that I'm going to take you to, just south of Shanghai. And what's one of the things that fascinates me about China is all the different foods that people manage or grow. You can come up with a list of over 300. And then if you get into medicinal plants, then it's probably almost every plant that grows in China. But just taking it down to food and drink and a few spices and so forth, you get at least 300 of them. You get trees and legumes and roots and tubers and so forth. And archaeology, as I say in this last line, is just scratching the surface. And kind of pun intended there. One of the big problems we face as archaeologists is preservation. I'd love a time machine, but that doesn't seem like it's going to happen. I keep saying, if they invent a time machine in my lifetime, I'm going to appear right next to me right now and tell me we do have It never works. So I guess it's not going to happen in my lifetime. But here you go. Just taking us to a local site, Crawford Lake. I don't know why I love that site, but anyway. They've reconstructed longhouses there, and this is a sense of what that community looked like. You can sort of get a feel for life out there, dynamic life, probably 300 people living there at any one time, but all we get archaeologically is what you see on your left. And you don't see much, but let me try to help you out. So there, blow that up a little bit, and for example, what you're seeing are holes where the posts were. And so the preservation is ridiculous. The posts are gone, obviously, but they leave their marks in the ground, their pits and so forth. We pick up the debris of bones and other kinds of things in the ground. So we have to deal with that. But we're fortunate that we've developed techniques where we can actually recover stuff that we thought you'd never be able to find. And one of the cool things about people in the past is that they left their garbage. They left their trail of debris, and we can find it. So my specialty is actually to recover the bits and pieces of plant remains and do the forensic work on these plant remains and figure out what they were and how they were evolving and what they mean. So this is a sample that we have from one site in Japan, for example. It's just filled with grain. A lot of it's barley, some of it's wheat and soybean and millet and so forth. But it's there. So in this case, they burned it, so it preserves pretty well. But of those 300 important economic plants in China, there's only 3 or 4 that we've actually made any headway with studying, figuring out how they came associated with people. And the 3 main ones are rice, peach, and bottle gourd. And Peach and bottle gourd were a bit of a surprise to me, but we've got good records of them. And rice, obviously, huge, crucial crop in the world, and we'll take a look at the story of rice because it's kind of intriguing. So what I want to do is start around 7,000 to 6,000 years ago, when we actually have a good idea what people were doing. And let's figure out then, after that, how people got there, how people actually developed the agriculture that we see 7,000 to 6,000 years ago. I'm going to take you to a site called Tianluoshan. And Tianluoshan is a remarkable site. Every time I go there, I never see a tourist because it's not in any of the guides that I'm aware of, and everybody wants to go to China to see the regular stuff, which I can't blame them. There's so much to see in China. It's extraordinary. But you guys know, so you can make an effort to get here. It's outside the city of Yuyao, and what's really interesting is they've built this huge structure over the site, so you can actually go to it and visit the museum and walk into the site. They're excavating it 365 days a year. And you can see what's under the dome here. Massive archaeological site. Huge. It's a metal roof. I was there during the monsoons when the rain was hitting that roof. You couldn't hear yourself speak to anybody. It was crazy. But really, really a phenomenal area. Absolutely rich. The aquatic resources around this region are extraordinary, and this is just an example of how rich this area is. There's nothing impoverished about it at all. The site lies below the water table today, so you can see the site it's over 2 meters deep, 2.5 meters to 3 meters down, and much of the site still sits below water, because people lived in this wetland and they built their houses, they built their structures right in this wetland to take advantage of these resources. After all, perhaps we're basically lazy, and why set up on a mountainside and walk down to get these resources when you can camp yourself right in them? I don't know. But this is incredible. I mean, think about this. This is 7,000 to 6,000 years ago. What you're looking at is wooden posts, wooden walls, artifacts, and so forth. And this is what these structures probably looked like. This is a reconstruction at another site nearby. And so this was to keep the floors high and dry. And you can also see that some of the walls, not just the posts are there, but if you look at this, there's a curious wall that's curved here. There's another part of it here that comes around. There's also kind of a wooden walkway, it's not in this picture, that takes you out of the site. And here's something really, really intriguing. I didn't realize how crucial this was until I watched a program on architecture the other day on, it was a Discovery Channel or something. But here are these rectangular posts sunk into this wetland. But if you sink a post into a wetland, it's going to keep sinking. You know, if you stick a pencil in mud, it's just going to keep going down, 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 down. Here's what they did. They actually built a wooden platform about this big by this big so that the post could float in the mud, much like this. And my very sketchy knowledge about architecture indicates from that program I watched that one of the first instances of this kind of engineering in North America was in Chicago's waterfront back in the late 1800s. They're trying to figure out how to build huge buildings on this lakefront where the sediments are really, really soft and full of water. And so they developed this technique in Chicago. But they were doing it in China for thousands and thousands of years. These people are brilliant, just brilliant engineering. They had brilliant engineering skills. The artifacts here are incredible. Archaeology is very much part of a problem with data management. Huge assortment of artifacts. And this is just one collection from one part of the site. It's filled with bone and stone tools and pottery. It's just a huge quantity of stuff. but they're also carving wood. And this is one of the most fascinating artifacts they found at this site. Now, you could interpret this any way you want. Maybe it's a water buffalo, maybe it's a fruit, but it's really intriguing. Nobody knows quite what that is. And the preservation is a problem, but this is they put the artifacts in those concrete basins filled with water, and they just leave them in the water so they won't disappear. It's also incredibly rich because it's the halfway point in the north-south flyway for migratory waterfowl. They all settle in the Yangtze Valley on their way up north and on their way south during the migration season. So we find a lot of waterfowl in these sites too. And these are a few things we also find at Tianlushan. They were harvesting huge quantities of acorns. Probably upwards of 20,000 acorns in this pit. Now, they've surrounded the pit with plastic so that it doesn't disappear, so you can go in and see the acorns. There's a water buffalo. Don't know if it's domesticated or not. And this is just a small portion of rice that they've recovered from the site. Just incredible. So 7,000 to 6,000 years ago, there were water buffalo here. They were harvesting acorns and growing huge quantities of rice. And what is rice, after all? You know, rice is a grass. And when I first started working in China in 1986 to 1990, we didn't even know if wild rice grew in China. But we now know. A Japanese scholar published a paper in 1996 documenting the distribution of wild rice throughout southern China. And much earlier than this, there was a slightly warmer period, and rice had moved further north. So it's in the Yangtze Valley. I mean, rice is botanically a complex plant. Lots of genetic variation, which is what you need if you're going to domesticate the plant. You need attributes that you can then select. And so wild rice comes in an annual form and a perennial form, but in any case, in the wild, it really doesn't look like much. When it's domesticated, it becomes more sort of, well, you'll see in a second, it becomes more developed, lots more productivity and so forth. The other thing that complicates things is once you select varieties that you've isolated from its wild ancestors and you've got features in it that you like, it still back crosses with its wild ancestor. And wild ancestor is actually pretty dominant, so it keeps reverting back to the wild. But now, today, there's a cross between the wild and the domesticated form that is a completely different subspecies, and most agronomists consider it a pest. And so agronomists are spending lots of money, research money, on figuring out how to get rid of this cross from fields. And it grows, even if you're growing this rice in Louisiana today, they still get this cross between wild and domesticated rice they can't get rid of. So there are lots of characteristics we find in wild rice that domesticated rice doesn't have. And I don't want to look at all of them, but the different colors. If you look at the wild rice, each plant produces very, very few seeds. So there's not much there to feed you. So why would you be attracted to it in the first place? But one of the most important characteristics, because we're basically lazy, is that we don't want to have to work too hard to get this rice. So wild rice, like wild wheat, wild barley, even maize, corn, disperses its seeds naturally. It's got to do that. So it shatters. You can see in this, you can see right here that the grains are falling off the plant naturally, much like the leaves fall off the trees in the fall right now. And they do this by growing a layer of cells at the base of the fruit, and it just simply cuts the grain off. But the domesticated forms have stopped the growth of that cell layer, and the grains don't fall from the plant. So it makes it a whole lot easier for us to harvest. You're not competing with birds and other organisms. We just go in and pull the plant out. And as a forensic specialist dealing with rice and other plants, you can actually get in and look at the cellular structures And you could determine the degree to which it's shattering. So these cells are really torn up, meaning that you've really had to rip this plant apart. These are kind of intermediate, and these are relatively clean breaks. So it means that this stuff shattered really naturally. And if you could find this in archaeological material, look at these cells, you can figure out what's going on with that rice in the past. We figured out that nearly half the rice at Tianlushan is not shattering. They'd figured out how to get it not to shatter, which is really kind of interesting. So lots going on at Tianlushan at this time, and I just put a few things up here. They're producing rice and raising pigs, and the oak forests were so productive that could not be natural. So they were likely maintaining oak woodlands and getting rid of some of the other trees so that the oaks would produce more. You can do that simply by burning. Oak is really fire tolerant, so you can really help the acorns that way. They're probably managing a lot of other plants. There's even seeds that some archaeologists believe are tea. I didn't do that work myself, but it looks like they may be right. There's lots of other things too. Hunting, fishing, gathering. They don't seem to have had many connections to the outside, which is kind of weird because we do see trade in other societies at this time, but nobody has found any clear evidence of much outside contact with these people. They're incredibly localized. And there's no evidence of class-based society, no evidence of political leadership, no evidence of any authority here. People seem to be relatively egalitarian, taking care of themselves, and it was a relatively small-scale society. All the while, they're actually sort of primitive bioengineers. They're changing rice and peach and pigs and other organisms, which fascinates me. But the earliest confirmed rice before that. So now we got to figure out, how did Tianlushan develop? How did these people become farmers, if that's what we want to call them? How did they come to build this huge community? What's their history? And that's what I'm really curious about. Well, there is rice a bit older throughout China, and you can see it in this map. There's a distribution way out that goes way beyond the lower Yangtze Valley. So if this is a source of rice and it's out here by 8,000 years ago, then you would assume that there's more going on earlier, and you'd be right. So there are a set of sites. There's a set of sites in this region dating between 11,000 and 7,500 years ago. So these are the ancestors of Tianlushan people. And we call it the Shangshan culture because it's named after a town, a community with a site called, and they named it Shangshan. And we've got a cooperative project going on between us here at University of Toronto and the Zhejiang Provincial Institute of Archaeology, as well as Fudan University in Shanghai. We're all working together to kind of sort these issues out. So let's see what's going on with the Shangshan culture. So it's in this area, and Tianlushan sits way up here. And you'll see in a minute what the difference is in a second. So the question is, why here as opposed to some of these other places? Coming up to that in a minute. But so we looked at Tianlushan, it's in green, so it's right here. And now we've got a series of sites that precede it. And those are the sites where we hope we've got some of the answers. So that's the period we're interested in. And one of the huge problems is we don't know who their ancestors are. So the folks who would precede them would be called the Upper Paleolithic, people who would have had some kind of a Paleolithic diet, but nobody's ever found them there. We don't know who they are, even if they're there. Big mystery right now. So they're the oldest sites in the region right now, the ones we're looking at. So here's the story, and this is what kind of mystifies us. These sites are all in these river valleys, and they're isolated from each other. They're two side by side, and they're surrounded by mountains. So we get these early sites nestled into these river valleys, surrounded by mountains. There's no rice in the area today. People don't grow rice there today. They grow dry crops. No rice. So would these people be rice farmers? And that's what we checked out. So I'll take you to the Shangshan site itself. It's huge. Dates to around 8,500 years ago, and the population looks like it might have been quite large. So this is a quick video clip we took of this. They've excavated 2 locations at the site, and the whole area is an archaeological site. And the site is really complex. Pits and houses and just extraordinary. They didn't leave a lot of garbage, unfortunately. I'm not sure what's going on there. So I'm going to take you to a site called Chaotou in a second, and then down to Huxi right here. So Chaotou is kind of curious because it's maybe a little bit older than Shangshan. Sits in this little river valley, dry today, no rice. These little squares show where I took pictures, so we're going to zoom in on the site. And actually, if you go to Google Earth and you zoom in, they've got these high-resolution aerial photographs that actually show the site. If you look closely, this is actually the excavation right here. And these little places are where I took pictures. So I geocode everything, and that's where I take pictures and stuff. So there's a terrace edge here. There's a big development here and a river here. And so the site is here, and here's what we got. And it's very simple right now, but there's the terrace edge. But what's really curious about this site is the folks who lived there spent time building a huge ditch. Now, how big was that ditch, you might ask? Well, I'm glad you asked. A lot of excavation here, and this is how big the ditch is. It is a couple of meters deep, and look at this. They put a lot of work into this ditch. I mean, so we've got people living on this terrace, and they are, for some reason, they've decided to build a huge ditch at the site. And we don't know why, because we're not sure where the ditch goes or where it comes from. Where the buildings are all next to us, that's where we figure the ditch secrets lie, but they're all gone. So we're not really sure what's going on here. Could be defensive. Could be that they're trying to manage water, but it's really dry here today. So why would they be managing water? Well, the monsoons were further north at this time, and it's quite possible the monsoons were fiercer back then. Difficult to say. But pottery at this time, just showing you an example, some pottery from the Huxi site, and this blew us away, and this is what really confused the issue. This pottery is the finest pottery in the world, dating to around 9,000 years ago, to 8,500 years ago. It's thin, it's painted, it's gorgeous. And so when the Chinese archaeologists first looked at this material, they thought it's all Bronze Age. And then they started getting radiocarbon dates, and the dates all started showing it's 9,000 years old, and it's really quite puzzling. Beautiful pottery, but they were also making some not so pretty pottery. But this is what really excites me. They're making these really big flared pots, huge trays, big vessels. In my technical terms, we call it sort of crudware, really cruddy pottery. It's rough, ready-made, quick stuff. But they were using rice chaff in this pottery. They were taking the rice grains out of the chaff, and then they were taking this chaff and mixing it in with the clay and making pots from it. So, we figured there's rice around. But how much rice? Must be a lot of rice back then. There's also rice grain impressions in these pots, so you can just barely make out this impression right there. It's rice. So we know there's rice there. So I'm going to take you to the site where this pottery is from, Huxi, right here. Not much has been excavated here yet. They've got permission to excavate a small pit at this site. Small pit. They call this a test pit in China. To me, a test pit is a 1 meter square that goes down a couple of feet. In China, a test pit is a massive, massive excavation. It's all relative. So far, we really want to get in and dig more at the site, but we went to this city and had a really formal lunch with the mayor and his officials, and the mayor promptly announced in the middle of lunch that he had no interest in archaeology, told us we were just going to get in his way, and that his only purpose in being mayor of this city is to develop the city and leave his monuments. Mares, usually in China, are parachuted in from the outside. They're hooked up to the elite structure in China, and they have no roots in the community. So we didn't get anywhere with them. It's very frustrating. There is a new mayor in the town, and he actually studied archaeology as a student. So we're hoping that he'll be a little bit more amenable to helping out with this project. But it's really fascinating. This is another ditch, and this is the ditch as it filled. So you've got everything in this pit here is Shangshan culture, about 1.5 meters of debris. It's all Shangshan culture stuff. It filled this ditch. And again, what the heck is this ditch doing here? And, so we actually figured this out. So what we did was we sampled the soil in this ditch to look for the microfossils that are in this soil. And so it's hard to excavate this stuff, but we got in and got these samples, and we found the little bases of the rice fruits. About 100 of them, and you could actually see the cellular structure on the base of them to tell whether they were shattering or not. And about 1/3 of the rice there has been selected to be domesticated. So these folks are actually changing the rice. So what does the ditch and the site and the rice have to do with each other? And it's a curious issue. So we have put together a hypothesis. We've got a story that we think works, and we published this about 6 months ago or so. And so here's a diagram. If we look at this, different levels in this, the rice comes up through this sample, and looking at the little microfossils, we were able to figure out the vegetation history here. What we're looking at are little silica structures that grass plants produce. So grass, as you know, isn't woody, but it's still really stiff and scratchy. You walk through grass blades, you can get cut pretty badly. That's because grass plants produce cells that have silica bodies in them, essentially sand. But that little silica crystal molds to the inside of that cell and takes on the form of that cell. And then when the plant disappears, of course, the silica remains, and you can recover it and identify it. So what we see here are, in the dark shaded bars, is the quantity of these little silica bodies that come from the chaff of the rice grain itself. So this indicates that the rice grains are falling into the water or into this ditch and being left behind. The little white bars here indicate rice leaf structures that are falling in. So here we have lots of grain falling into the pond or into this ditch with just a few leaves. So rice isn't very common, but the seeds are getting into it, into the soil. But as time goes on, there seems to be more rice and lots of leaves decaying into the sediment and fewer of the grains. Okay, so my interpretation of this is that rice is becoming more abundant, but it's actually changing into the domesticated form. Fewer grains are being naturally lost, and the people are harvesting it. And so we're seeing this development as time goes on. This is a grass that grows in slightly drier habitats next to ditches and so forth. This is Miscanthus, which I actually have growing outside my house. It's a beautiful oriental grass from China. Apparently some states in the United States don't permit you to grow it because it's so invasive, but it's pretty. And Phragmites, which is a real pain in the ecology around here, is just in the background, so much so that you can barely see it. So we're seeing the development of a habitat here that may very well have been designed to attract rice to it. So it's possible that the ditch is somehow being used to manage water so that they can grow rice. Or they built this ditch to bring water into the site to change the area so that it was more productive, or to keep them drier, for defense, whatever. And the bonus was that rice loved it too and came in, and people got attracted to it. We don't know exactly what was going on. The work is so much in its initial stages that we want to. Well, anyway, there's the miscanthus that grows next to these water bodies. So we want to figure out what's going on there. So we know these people were growing rice. We know they were changing the landscape. And again, they have to be even more egalitarian, more small scale, and so forth than the people at Tianluoshan. So it's a really curious problem we have to deal with. Eventually, these folks seem to move down into the lowlands where Tianluoshan is and settle down into these areas that are today below sea level. And Kwahuchao, this site that I've highlighted in green, seems to be that site, which was the first one down in the lowlands. So let's go into Kwahuchao right here. And this is also really interesting, just as a side note. I've got colleagues who actually think that these are the cultures, Homudu, Tianluoshan, Kwahuchao, that actually were the ancestors of the people who eventually moved out into Polynesia. But that's a whole other story. But here's Kwahuchao, right here, and it sits on the edge of a lake. So there are actually a couple of sites here, but main location is right here. There's a lake here, and really this site was excavated because the folks in the city of Hangzhou have a wonderful, wonderful park called West Lake, or Shihu. And West Lake is the big tourist attraction in Hangzhou. The people in the southern part of Hangzhou wanted to draw some of that tourist traffic in, so they wanted to build a replica of that massive park, sort of China's version of Stanley Park. And so they did. And that led to the excavation of this site. So there's the site situated right there. And this is two angles of it. So when they excavated, the area was really dry. This is a dried out riverbed. There's just no water in there today at all. But when they excavated the site, they hit water table in here. And much of the site's really well preserved. The water level has gone up today, and now they've got a museum there. I can't think of a country in the world that has more money for museums. I mean, here we struggle to keep museums afloat. But in China, you want a museum? Build your museum, and the funding is unlimited. It's fantastic. Unfortunately, there are people who are not getting money, and of course there are issues with that. But it's a gorgeous museum, and part of it is built over the waterlogged portion of the site. So the lake rose to make this park, so they had to create this museum so that you could actually go under the lake and see what's left of this site. So you go into the museum, and you go down into this site, and you see some of the waterlogged sediments, and they got something preserved in this greenhouse-like structure. It's a humidity-controlled, temperature-controlled setting for perhaps the oldest boat in China. This is a dugout canoe sitting right here. It's a dugout canoe. And when this site met its demise, this boat was being repaired. In fact, it was in a dry dock sort of situation. It was on stakes raised up above the ground surface, and it had been undergoing repair. And they actually found the repair as it had been almost completed before the waters rose. They didn't get into the boat in time. But there's lots of wooden structures here. There are acorn storage pits, and this is a storage pit for acorn, and it's a 9,000-year-old, it's about a 7,500-year-old cold cellar where they can keep the temperature and the water levels about right to preserve these acorns for a very, very long time. And the kinds of animals and plants that they got from this site are extraordinary. Here are all the waterfowl, many of which are these migratory birds. They've even got some dolphin. This site would have been very close to the ocean at the time, very close to the ocean. Raccoon dog, different forms of cats, weasel, badger. Get a load of this. Tiger, rhinoceros, different forms of deer, and the water buffalo. So there's quite a flora and fauna here, and not only that, but there are parasites that come out of the feces of pigs that show up in the sediment here too. So we know they're raising pigs because of the whipworm that comes in. This site doesn't seem to have been abandoned because people simply overused the resources or got pushed out by wharf or anything like that. And speaking of global warming and sea rising, we're not in the only period of our history where these kinds of things happened. So when Kwahuchao was occupied, the ocean was where you can see it in blue there. And by about 7,300 years ago, these guys were sitting right on a beach. And then by 7,000 years ago, it was underwater. There was this warming period around about 7,000, 8,000 years ago, and there was a period of when the sea levels rose particularly high. And this is why I tell people, with global warming today, if you're going to buy real estate in Shanghai, get a higher level, go sort of 6th floor or higher, and I think you'll be safe, be good. But otherwise, I don't think you're going to see me buying it too soon. Besides that, who can afford it? Shanghai is amazing. They were using a lot of aquatic resources here, water chestnut and cattail and rice and foxnut, pondweed as well. Just amazing stuff they were using. Tortoise shell shows that they were going after these water critters too. And the rice here is almost about 40% non-shattering. So they're domesticating this rice too. But the point is, between this site and if we look at Huxi, where it's 30% domesticated, Kuojiao is 40%, and Tianlushan around 50%, it's taking thousands of years to get this done. Thousands of years. This isn't sort of a plan to domesticate rice. So it very well may be simply an unexpected result of things they were doing with rice, either growing it and harvesting it in particular ways, and it kept shifting, and they liked what it was shifting to, so they collected those seeds, and eventually we get domesticated rice. But it took a long time. But it isn't just all about rice. They were domesticating the peach as well, which is really intriguing. So a couple of years ago, we actually sorted out much of the data on peach, and we're quite surprised to see that we actually get evidence of its domestication. So the three of us partners, they are the three partners in crime on this paper, and we got this paper published on rice. Senior author is the main botanical archaeologist in China, Zheng Yunfei. There's me, and then this gentleman, Mr. Chen, is actually, he's done graduate work in Chinese medicine, which actually means he's a trained botanist. He's the best field botanist I've ever met in China. So we go out in the field together, and he knows every single plant, their nuances, and so forth. So he did a lot of the hard slogging work on this peach stuff. We even got into a fruit growers magazine in Washington State. It was kind of cool to get that. I like this sometimes more than publishing in the scientific literature. Kind of fun, but they put together a great illustration, so I'm going to use it. So we see the changing of the peach over time from relatively small to bigger and bigger ones, and this happens just within this narrow region in Zhejiang province, south of the Yangtze River. And so these folks understood the nature of how to manage trees. One of the really interesting things that puzzled me about peach, I didn't know anything much about peach before we went into this research. So one of the really fascinating things about the kind of work I do is, it seems like every other day I've got to learn something about something that I knew nothing about, because you got to know. It's not like CSI where I can turn to the brain in the room and say, tell me everything you know about peach so I can get on with my work. The world doesn't work like that. I got to do it myself. So What was really fascinating about this is that peaches can grow fruit within 2 years, but the second year you plant a sapling, you can get fruit from it. So it's not quite instant gratification, but if you're patient for a few years, you do get peaches. But it also responds to vegetative reproduction very, very quickly. So if you have your favorite peach tree and you take that branch from your favorite peach tree and stick it in the ground, it'll grow roots and you'll get more of that peach that you like. So peach responds very, very easily to vegetative reproduction. And my guess is that's what these people were doing. They knew what they were doing. Whether they were grafting, I'm not sure, but you go into fields and orchards in China, and people have their own techniques for grafting. I was standing there in a field. We'd climbed this mountainside to look at an archaeological site. Saw the site, but I got more fascinated by the farming. And there was this one tree growing in the middle of this field, and for the life of me, I couldn't figure out what it was. The trunk didn't look right for the leaves and all of that, so I couldn't figure out what was going on. But it was two completely different species. One they had grafted onto another. I think it was a persimmon branches had been grafted onto, I don't know what kind of a tree it was, but it wasn't a persimmon tree. And they were getting a good crop from it. That all looks like it may have started way, way back. So where does this leave us in all of this? Well, when we're looking at the origins of agriculture, some of the standard explanations are people were hungry, so they needed to plant crops. Well, my supervisor when I was a graduate student tended to be a little bit facetious, and he would say things like, starving people die, they don't innovate. I mean, it's sort of an off-the-cuff kind of remark, but when you think about it, if you're starving, you can't wait to develop a crop because you need something today to eat. So that doesn't quite work. So what we do find when we look at the Shangshan culture and Kuahuqiao and Tianloshan is these people are living in a really, really richly resourced area, potentially giving them the wherewithal to find the variety, the types of plants that they could then experiment with and manage. But they were likely dealing with some risks. We have to figure out what those risks were. I suspect that community identity was getting well developed so that they were really well informed and protective of their particular areas. Yet we see no evidence of conflict, but they just know their areas intimately. One of the things in terms of risk that I think is really important to come to terms with in this area is the annual flooding. And the seasonal temperature fluctuations, but flooding is probably a big deal. What we find in Southeast Asia particularly is that without rice in some areas, because they flood so regularly and so much, you probably couldn't make a living there or survive for long. So rice may have been a solution to the annual monsoonal floods in these areas. And of course, the Chinese are still trying to control the Yangtze River and other rivers by building monstrous dams. And that, again, has its own problems. So it's probably related to some kind of resource management, people trying to reduce risk by managing certain kinds of resources and bringing these resources closer to them so that they don't have to chase them or go after them too far. And it looks like very soon after the end of the Pleistocene, people started to change the landscape on their own. They started modifying the earth, digging ditches, burning the landscape, modifying marshlands, living in the marshlands, changing the ecology, all for their benefit. But none of it seems to be particularly detrimental. There seems to be a close almost symbiosis between people and the local ecology. And ultimately, we don't really know why they were developing agriculture here yet, but I think it has to do with some form of risk reduction rather than some purposeful plan to develop agriculture. I think it was an unintended consequence of these management processes. And so we have to think about what this might have to do with our lives today. And I actually wrote something out. Now, I'm just going to leave it in my briefcase, and maybe it's something we can talk about during the Q&A. But there are a number of things that do come to mind. One of them, at a very sort of food-oriented level, is that there appears to have been such an incredible diversity of crops back in the day. And today, we tend to be focusing on one or two cultivars, and then we get the corporate groups like Monsanto and so forth pushing the particular varieties that they want. In that regard, too, we put ourselves in a very tenuous position. And then the other point is that we have to deal with the wild ancestors of these crops. These wild ancestors still have genetics and variation that we can use and we need to benefit from. But they're considered weeds by agronomists, and they try to get rid of them. But we need them. And then we can move all the way up to lessons we may be able to take about global warming. We see people flourishing and innovating at a time when global warming was even more extreme than I think it's going to be. And what can we see in terms of their strategies that we could learn from? Unfortunately, sometimes I get a little negative. Maybe we've gone too far down this one-way street. And maybe we're actually paving a way to our demise. But perhaps if we continue to educate ourselves, learn more about what our ancestors did in these circumstances, we're not going to meet our demise too soon. But perhaps we can chat about all that in our Q&A.